Well, joining us now from Canberra, former Australian diplomat Tony Kevin. Tony was Australia's ambassador to Poland, among other places, in the 1990s. Also spent time in our embassy in Moscow at the height of the Cold War in the 60s. He's author of the travel memoir Return to Moscow. And also in Canberra tonight, John Blaxland, Professor of International Security and Intelligence Study at ANU. He's a former Director of Joint Intelligence Operations and was Australia's Defence Attaché to Thailand and Myanmar. Welcome to you both. First to you, John Blaxland, what do you make of Luke Harding's claim there that we are seeing not only another Cold War, but that Vladimir Putin may well be winning?
I think it needs to be put in context. On one level, it looks like the Cold War is on again, and Lawrence Friedman's talked about Cold War 2.0. This isn't an ideological Cold War, though. This is a harking back to the kind of bipolar world that I think Putin would like to see, but the world is actually multipolar now. Russia is not the dominant power it once was, and what it has is a demographic downwards trend, and it has an economy that is very much reliant on oil, on petrodollars, and military technology and its nuclear arsenal. And that's really the strong points of the Putin repertoire, if you like. And of course, if you have an economy that's not doing that well and the demographic trends aren't pointing very well, it's kind of convenient to beat the can of an external threat and burnish your credentials by positing yourself as the strongman, as the defender of the Russian homeland, painting the external foe in dark, very adversarial tones. That's very convenient. So what we've seen is the manifestation of that in this return of the Cold War techniques, ones I wrote about with my colleagues David Horner and Rhys Crawley in the 3-volume history of ASIO, which is largely about countering Soviet espionage in Australia during the Cold War. A lot of the techniques, it seems, are back on.
Tony Kevin, of course, the big threat underpinning the Cold War was the possibility of a nuclear conflagration. Is John Blaxland right that, given that that is the preeminent strength that Russia retains, their nuclear arsenal, that we have got concerns that are quite valid now?
Thank you for inviting me onto the program. I've just heard from Luke Harding of an advanced case of Russophobia and paranoia about Russia. And Luke said one correct thing. He said, for the Russians, the Cold War never ended. Well, I think the truth is that for people like Luke, the Cold War never ended. I'm hoping that my discussion with John Blaxland here will be a little more grounded in reality. Russia has certainly maintained a nuclear deterrent and recently reaffirmed the strength of it. And that means that any discussion of Russian weakness compared to the West is in a sense irrelevant. Russia is A, both in possession of a strong nuclear deterrent, and B, ready to use it if its own survival is threatened by the West. What we're seeing in the world today over the last few years is a concerted moving in on Russia by the West. In many ways and at many levels, we see a military threat building up on Russia's own borders. We see an information warfare threat campaign building up in the media. We see constant efforts to demoralise and humiliate and belittle Russia. And what we heard tonight in the early part of the programme was an example of that.
Yet, Tony, of course, as all of that has been happening, Russia has moved to annex Crimea, destabilising eastern Ukraine, and interfering in a number of elections, including that of the United States. They're hardly a passive and innocent player in all this. All the while, Vladimir Putin bumping off potential rivals.
Well, what you say is all based on certain assumptions, and there's a counter-narrative on all these things, and I try to reference that in my book, Return to Moscow. Once you've got a whole information system, which I now call a disinformation system, operating at full tilt to, as it were, throw counterintuitive non-facts around an echo chamber and cross-reference them all the time, you finish up with a sort of statement like the one you just made. Unfortunately, it would take more than a few minutes discussion to untangle all those assumptions. But let's just get back to the Skripal poisoning. There are two things about that I'd like to say. First of all, where was the Russian motive to, as it were, give the West a free kick at them, to rain on their parade, their forthcoming World Cup and their major presidential election only once every 6 years, by doing something as cack-handed and stupid as this. And secondly, there are known facts which haven't been referenced yet, but I've seen them from good sources on the internet media, that the technology of this nerve gas actually leaked out of Russia in the early 1990s. It went to America, it went to Britain, it went to Sweden, it went to Czechoslovakia, it went to many countries. And there are many places where this nerve agent could have been made. And frankly, the countries that are most obviously in line of suspicion are Britain and the United States.
John Blaxland, what do you think of that? Are we guilty of a collective Russophobia? Are we building Fort Denison again? The Russians are coming?
Look, I hear what Tony is saying, and I get where he's coming from. There's certainly, the West is certainly not completely innocent. And the actions in the immediate post-Cold War era, when NATO expanded, when deals were broken, and more recently when the West, particularly the United States under Hillary Clinton, basically broke a promise over Libya and the response to protect people there. We basically we nixed a deal. The Russians understandably feel that the West can't be trusted. So Tony's quite right there. But I think to paint this in terms of the West being out to get Russia is perhaps only pointing one side of this, because there certainly is a long tradition in Russian military parlance of Maskirova, of the idea of deception, of playing, of information operations, of basically playing with your head. This is something that I think the Russians are as good, if not better, than the West. And I think your point about the elections, John Barron, last year, or the year before, I should say, in the United States, and the way that the Russians have played politics in the United States speaks to that. We now have, Tony talked about an echo chamber. It's not just one voice that's being echoing there, there's multiple voices. And it is indeed very difficult to discern between fact and fiction at the moment. Even the President of the United States is talking about, fake news. That's adding to the confusion in the story. But I do think it's important to make the point there is a very I would contend with what Tony said. I think the Russians do have a motive here. They were pretty upset about what happened in Korea, in the Korean Winter Olympics. They were very offended to be excluded from that. And this, so my sense is also, like Lou said, there is, I think, an internal rationale for Putin, who is himself a former KGB officer. He's a practiced hand at this, of playing mental games with those who would want to actually think about perhaps doing something contrary to Putin. Putin's been in power a long time. He's got lots of enemies. This is one way of actually making clear to those would-be potential turncoats that watch out, because even if I do a deal, I can come out and get you. And I take Tony's point that there may be, some damage that is imposed on Russia. My sense is that this may well have been a slight miscalculation. That perhaps because of Brexit, there's a thing here. My sense is that perhaps Putin thought that Brexit would see Europe not potentially unite with Britain in response, and that may well be part of the miscalculation.
Unfortunately, it's a topic we're going to have to revisit on another day. But for now, Kevin John Blaxland, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure, John.